Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about a certain kind of writing called a personal narrative. We're going to take 5 different sessions, 5 days. We're going to create your own personal narrative about a time when you learned an important lesson. So, when you're thinking about what you'll write about, I don't want you to feel like you have to write about something serious. Mine, as you will see, was a time I learned a lesson in a funny way. So, the first thing that we're going to do, I'm going to read you a personal narrative that I wrote. You'll read along with me. And while you're listening, I want you to listen and notice a few things. You can write down your ideas or just think about them in your head. But I want you to think about what made this piece of writing entertaining to you. I want you to think about what is the pattern of any good story that we read. Do they follow a similar pattern? And for the third thing, I want you to think about what writing or author tools I used to make my story better. So here we go. And just so you know, the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but this is a story about me. I was the first grader, and I'll be telling the story. Okay. Fairyland. First graders will believe anything you say. I know it's true because I once was the little girl who would believe anything my older sister would tell me. Everything. I believed her about the booger eating rock. I believed her about the witch that lived in our closet. I believed and believed and believed, but one day she took it too far. It all started on our 1 mile walk to school. Every day I would walk to school with my sister Emma and her friend Becky. They were both fourth graders, so grown up in my 6-year-old eyes. Mostly I was the tag along. They were in charge of making sure I was getting to school safely, but other than that, I was completely ignored while they talked about grown up stuff like homework, softball, and boys. The only attention I got from them was when they told me to hurry up or when they decided to make fun of me. On one particular day, it had rained the night before. Puddles of still water lined the streets right next to the sidewalks. There seemed to be hundreds of them, each of them reflecting the beautiful sky, puffy white clouds, and tall, colorful autumn trees that lined the streets where we lived. Lizzie! I suddenly heard my sister say in that voice that was half whisper, half shout, Look! She was bent over, staring into a puddle. Becky was right beside her doing the same. I walked over and tried to understand what she was looking at. You know what that is, right? She turned to ask me with her eyes wide. That's fairyland. Look at all of the trees. Look at the beautiful blue sky and clouds. She was pointing at all of the reflections in the puddle. Becky was playing right along, nodding to everything my sister said. You have always wanted to go to fairyland, haven't you? Wouldn't it be better to go there than to go to school? My brain was buzzing. I would love to go to fairyland. How had I never noticed that it was inside the puddles all along? I could totally see the trees, the sky, the clouds. It looked just like our world, but more magical. How can I go there? I asked. Well, there really there is really only one way, Emma replied, side glancing at Becky and then back to me. You have to jump in with both feet at the same time and yell, Fairyland, 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 and you'll be transported there. What? This was amazing news. It was everything I would ever need, everything I had ever dreamed of. I geared up, I squeezed my eyes closed, I swung both arms and leaped in with all my might. Fairyland, Fairyland, Fairyland! I squealed. I jumped, I splashed. Puddle water went flying and spraying. I waited. Nothing happened. I looked down and my white tights were muddy and soaked. I looked up and my sister and Becky were half a block down the road, laughing their heads off. I was angry and embarrassed and dirty. I knew I had been duped. I picked up my backpack and started the lonely walk of shame to school. It's been a long time since the fairyland trick was played on me. Looking back, one good thing came out of that day after all. That was the day my first grade brain stopped believing everything that my fourth grade sister told me. Okay, so going back to the questions we had at the beginning, What made this piece of writing entertaining? Maybe you noticed that I tried to tell something that was a funny story. This is a story my sisters and I still talk about to this day, even when we're grown-ups, that she was able to trick me into really believing that fairyland was inside of the puddles. So something that might make it entertaining is the way that it's told. We used a lot of dialogue in this writing so that you could hear what we were saying back and forth to each other. I tried to use some descriptive writing, and I tried to pick a funny moment, but a moment that could still teach a lesson. Second question was, what is the pattern of any good story? Most stories that we write and that we read and that we listen to and that we watch on movies have a problem and a solution. Leading up to the problem, there might be many little problems, but there's one big problem in the story, or one big climatic moment is what they're called. That's the most intense, the most exciting, the most suspenseful moment of the story. And then we hope that by the time the story is over, that will be resolved. It'll be solved, that problem. And the third one, what writing tools did I use to make my story better? We talked about a little bit with descriptive writing. Dialogue makes it sound better. Having a lesson that was sort of introduced at the beginning and then I came back to that lesson at the end. Those are all things that made it for a good story. So today, we want to talk about how when I chose my story, I did not choose something that happened across several years or weeks or even days. If I were to go back and time this event with a stopwatch, this event, beginning to end, my whole story may have lasted 5 minutes, probably less. And so we want to choose, when you're thinking about what story you're going to write, I want you to think of a small moment, something to zoom in on, because if you have to zoom in, it says when we zoom in on a small moment, we have time to tell the story with detail. We don't have to describe 45 things that happen. We're just focusing on one. And another reason is we can describe what it was like to be there with us. And we don't want to think about this as if it's a travel log or a journal entry. When I go back to read my journal entries, they're like, today we went to the store, then the next day, today we read a book together. And they're not very exciting. They don't have that story format of having a problem and then having to get it resolved. So here's your job today in this lesson. You need to choose a small moment that you would like to tell about in your story that you're going to write. I want you to write a list of times when you learned a lesson. And as you write those, I want you to think about which of those works best to write a story about. If it's something that took you 3 years to learn, that one won't work for this assignment. You need to think about a small moment where you learned a lesson that you could tell in a page or two of typing and where you could go into detail. So it needs to be something that lasts a short amount of time. That's your job today, is to brainstorm which thing you would like to write about and what lesson you learned through that event.